Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Secure Talk. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I'll be your host for this episode of Secure Talk. Today, we're going to be talking with Sean Falconer, who is the head of marketing and developer relations at Skyflow. Sean has previously worked at the World Health Organization and at Google. He's also the founder of Proven.com, which was acquired by Upward. He's also the co-host of a couple of podcasts, the Software Engineering Daily, and the sole host of data privacy and compliance podcast, Partially Redacted. We're going to be talking with Sean about data privacy strategies. What are the good things? What are some of the bad things? We're going to be talking about some of the issues with using tools such as ChatGPT in the context of data protection and privacy, and some more things. But before we do that, let's say hi to Sean. Sean, how are you today?
I'm good. It's great to be here. Nice to thank you for that wonderful introduction, Mark.
My pleasure. Hey, so whereabouts are you located?
I live in San Francisco.
Okay.
And I'm a Canadian, so I grew up in Canada, and I've been living now in California for about 13 years.
Wow. Yeah. No. I mean, San Francisco is a great city. It's not without its issues, of course, but just being there and then being close to Silicon Valley and all the different things that happen there, it's got to be a really fun place to live. How's the weather these days?
It's a little up and down. Yesterday was beautiful. Today, not so much. This is like, in many ways, the summertime in San Francisco, in particular, the area that I live in, is some of the worst weather that happens in in the Bay Area. It's kind of the winter time of this area of San Francisco. So lots of foggy days, lots of gray. It does wear on you a little bit, but then you venture outside the city 10 miles and you're into often 100-degree sunny temperature, and then you're ready to kind of run back to the winter fell of San Francisco.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember the movie 48 Hours with Nick Nolte and Eddie Murphy.
I know the movie, but I haven't seen it.
Okay, so there's a line in there that's actually originally was, I think it was a quote from Mark Twain, and he said, "The coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco." So sounds like things haven't changed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me ask you, your title is head of marketing, which I get, but you're head of marketing and developer relations, which is kind of an unusual combination from what I've seen in the past. But what does that mean?
So I was originally joined Skyflow as head of developer relations, and my early part of my career was engineering, and I was I've done multiple degrees in computer science, so I have a lot of engineering training, and I also worked sort of on the research side of computer science for a number of years. And in the company that I founded, I was also the technical co-founder there. So I've done a lot of technical things, and then I moved over time into developer relations at Google and developer experience, and then joined Skyflow to do the same. But developer relations at Skyflow at the time was I reported directly to the CMO. So it was my first time technically within a marketing department. But I've done a lot of marketing type work, traditional marketing work as well, when I was growing my company, mostly because I had to. There was just like nobody else to do it. And that's kind of the nature of when you're a founder of a company. Sometimes you just have to step in and take on roles or do work that maybe you don't have training in, but you have to figure it out if you want to survive as a company. And so I did a lot of that stuff, both from product positioning, messaging, content marketing, demand, and so forth. And I learned some of those skills. So then when in Skyflow, when the original CMO decided to leave the company and move on, we had a gap in terms of who would be the leader of the marketing department. And over time, because we are a very technical product, we sell to technical leaders of companies, which is not only do I have that experience as a former CTO myself, but I think I understand that world and understand how to communicate with those types of folks, that I ended up stepping into the role of head of marketing. But there was also no one to lead developer relations at the same time. So I just kind of ended up in this place where I had these dual roles.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I want to stay on the marketing track for a second, even though this is Secure Talk. But it's interesting to me because, one of the things that I talk to cybersecurity and data protection companies about oftentimes is how they go out and grow their business. And, as you kind of moved into that marketing role and ramped up, did you, leverage any books or associations or seminars? I mean, because you want to adopt best practices, but how did you do that?
I actually listen to a lot of podcasts, which
Hmm.
is kind of my main channel for like diving deep into almost any topic. Like there's so much content that exists
Yeah.
in the world of podcasts, and also so many different experts. It's like a way to get access to CEOs and CTOs and CMOs, essentially like really established leaders in almost any kind of functional area at well-known companies that have had a lot of success. You can find a podcast where they're talking about their experience and sharing their best practices. So I consume a lot of content that way, and it's also a great way because you can listen to it and be doing other things. So it's a
Yeah.
passive way to learn. And then of course, as if something comes up in one of those podcasts where they're talking about some concept that I am maybe not familiar with, but I'm interested in, then I'll do a deeper dive, either leveraging like internet resources to read about it, or potentially books. But I think with the speed of technology, that a lot of times books aren't necessarily the best resource, because a lot of times by the time the book comes out, it can be outdated in some
Yeah.
fashion. So sometimes it's much better to leverage things that are a little bit more real time, like podcasts or maybe YouTube or even blog posts.
Yeah, I can imagine a book about like, how to leverage GPT. And by the time it hits the street, the evolutions and iterations of these large language models have already just moved way beyond what anybody could have written about before.
Yeah.
Do you, in the context of marketing, do you have any specific recommendations for podcasts?
So I love this. I think SaaStr podcast is a great one.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really. It's not purely marketing. There's of course sales leaders and so forth. But although hearing from them as someone working in marketing is also valuable because so much of marketing is also the team relationship and the relationship that you build with sales.
Hmm.
So that can be really helpful in terms of just like understanding the world of sales and having better insight there. It allows you to build a better relationship and understand where you fit into that world. But that's really one of my go-tos because they have so many really accomplished guests on there, and you can learn a lot. And
Well,
I
they have a,
think
a whole ecosystem too. It's a whole community. I love their site, their newsletters. I haven't been to any of their events yet, and I haven't listened to the podcast, but now it's on my list.
yeah. And then I
So,
think
oh, go ahead.
Dave Kellogg, if you know who he is, he's I think he's been a CEO, a CMO, and either and I think a CFO or
Hmm.
a CRO, basically like three different C-level. He's former Salesforce guy, quite famous in the world of SaaS,
Hmm.
and I read pretty much everything that he writes about on
Hmm.
kellogg.com. So he has a lot of really fantastic material in there, just based on his learnings and best practices over the years. So that's kind of like my go-to Bible with a lot of this stuff. And then he's of course been a guest on many podcasts. So sometimes I'll just look him up, essentially do a search for his name and listen to anything that he has to say.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for those recommendations. Hey, so let's get into the subject of data privacy strategy. I mean, every company knows that protecting their data is important. Many have adopted some type of playbook or strategy, but there are, some are effective and some are not. Why don't you talk a little bit about what a data privacy strategy is and why some of them aren't as effective as they could be?
Yeah, so I think that there's a number of issues that companies typically struggle with. And I think one of the big issues is that in the early days of a company, a lot of times you're so focused on your go to market, finding product market fit, and whatever the sort of like mission of the company is. So thinking about how you actually manage data and where it ends up, and also ultimately how you protect it, a lot of times is an afterthought unless you happen to be in a heavily regulated industry. Like if you're collecting credit card data, then you're going to need to comply with PCI DSS, and then there's different ways of doing that. Or if you were in somewhere like digital health, then in the United States you're going to butt it to things like HIPAA. But a lot of times, even collecting the things that we see in data breaches, a lot of times that's not necessarily something like someone's credit card information. A lot of times it's account information. It's their home address, their name, their email. And even though we might not think about those things as sensitive as someone's, say, social security number or their credit card number, it still doesn't feel good as a consumer to know that my records and 25 million of my friends and colleagues records are out there somewhere on the web and being used for potentially nefarious purposes. So I think the big challenge that a lot of companies have is that they're so focused on sort of building and scaling that they're not thinking about the management of the information. And what ends up happening when you're not really thinking about that from the early days of the company is, if you are successful, then you get to a place where essentially your information about your customers is going to be all over the place. You've built these big scaled systems through using modern technology, containerization, and you got application databases, probably downstream analytical stores, like maybe it's a Snowflake or Databricks or something like that. But and you have logging systems. Essentially, that information about your customers ends up in like thousands of different locations. And by that time, when that happens, it's very, very difficult to try to get a handle on that problem. And what ends up happening is companies end up spending a lot of money on building better fences around their infrastructure to try to protect it and protect all these different locations where that data ends up. But it's essentially an intractable problem at that point. It's like, the analogy I always like to use is, imagine if instead of having, one copy of your passport that you keep in a safe location in your home, you created thousands of copies of your passport and then you put them all over the place and then you try to protect all those locations. That is a much more difficult problem to solve than having one copy of your passport that you keep in a safe location. But that's essentially what we do with data. So we put data all over the place and then we run around applying, essentially chicken wire and duct tape and various like point solutions to try to stop the floodgates or the leaky faucet issues here, where someone might get in and get a hold of that data, and it's in so many different places, it's almost impossible to holistically protect it.
So what's the alternative?
So I mean, the alternative is an approach that was originally pioneered by companies like Google, Netflix, Apple, and a handful of others, which is this pattern of technology known as the data privacy vault. And similar in the same respect that you think about something like a secrets vault, which is based around this principle of isolation, we realize that something like passwords and API keys are something special that we don't want to essentially co-locate with our source code, so we put it in this special location of the secrets vault. It's the same idea around the concept of a data privacy vault. We're essentially saying that customer data is something special, like someone's passport. So it requires different treatment of the data than regular application data. And the key is to essentially, once you've made that decision that this thing is special and it needs to be treated that way, then you want to essentially isolate and protect it within something like a data privacy vault that is separate from your existing systems. So instead of essentially taking your customer data as well as any other application data, like clicks on a web page or something like that, and putting that in your database and then replicating it all over the place, move that customer data into this data privacy vault pattern, which is isolated and protected outside of your core systems. And essentially what you're doing is you're de-scoping your regular application infrastructure from the responsibilities of data security, data compliance, and privacy, essentially.
Could you walk me through like a use case? For example, let's say you have a startup, they're going to do a SaaS type business. They're going to be taking both customer information and then their customers' information as part of their SaaS platform. The tool is going to need to process that information. And how does this data privacy vault work in that scenario?
Okay, yeah, that's a great. So let's say essentially we're going to be collecting some sort of account information about somebody as an example. So
account information, and then when they start to use the tool, they will probably be using processing data that contains their customer or other kind of some type of sensitive data.
Okay, all right. So let's start with collection. So typically, what we do when we collect account information or any kind of like user PII, what we're doing is we have a web page, or maybe we have a mobile app, and we have some form where people enter that information. We collect it, we pass it through back to our API, and then eventually we're going to save that in some downstream services like a database, and then we might have the various replicas and backups of those systems, and maybe it ends up in a data warehouse. So instead, what we would do in the data privacy vault pattern, and this is the ideal scenario for any system where you want to really prioritize privacy and security, is we want to essentially de-identify that data as early in the life cycle as possible. So essentially what we can do is at collection in the front end system of the web page where we're collecting this information, instead of sending that account information, instead of sending that through your API gateway and then through your infrastructure, you would send that account information directly from your front end to your data privacy vault. And then the data privacy vault is now the single source of truth for that record. And in exchange, what the vault would do is give you essentially a pointer in the form of a token back to the front end. And then you would pass that token through your API gateway and your downstream systems. So now within your own infrastructure, you're not storing the original plain text values of the account data. You're essentially storing pointers in the form of these tokens. And if you're doing tokenization properly, in this case, there's no mathematical relationship between the original data and the token. So essentially you're de-scoping your systems, but you still have this reference in the form of a token. Because typically in our internal systems, very rarely is there like a business case for like why we need access to like PII information. Normally what we're doing is we're just passing that data around to different systems. And it's not until we're actually rendering the values or maybe passing it on to a third-party system do we actually ever need to retrieve and see the PII. So by essentially using these reference values instead, then we don't have to worry about potential exposure within our system. Because even if the tokens end up in a log file and then that log file gets compromised, the attacker is not getting anything but essentially a bunch of random strings.
Well, by doing that, is there any effect on, and I'm not sure what the metric is, but like if you're accessing data, is it, speed, for example, are there any effects in terms of slowing things down because you've got to reach out every time?
So you don't need to reach out every time. You only need to reach out when you actually need the original values. So most of the time within our internal systems, we're not actually doing any kind of processing against the PII values. Like all we're doing is essentially we're retrieving it. We might be retrieving it from a database and then passing that record to some other system, and then that system passes that record to some other system or something like that. But it's not until we actually need to, like in the case of the account information, let's say we log in, and then it's not until we go to our account page where the account page is going to show us our name, and maybe it shows some partial information about our phone number and maybe our address. It's not until we actually are rendering that information on screen do we actually need to retrieve it. So in that case, what we would do is we would pass the token values, just like we would treat those tokens essentially like the original values, or the way that we would normally treat plain text values within the infrastructure. We pass those to the front end application, and then essentially the front end application could exchange those tokens in the vault with the original values. So that you are going to end up with an extra API call, but it's worth the small increase there of introducing an extra API call to essentially de-scope your system from compliance. Because when you start to think about things like data residency challenges, one of the big challenges that a lot of companies have now is like global expansion. So, when GDPR came in 2018, a lot of companies that were operating in Europe and also the United States, they were like, okay, well, we'll go and we'll create a data center in Germany so that we can comply with data residency laws in Germany. And then maybe we'll also have a US-based data center. But now there's more and more countries that are introducing laws like this, like Australia, Brazil, Canada, Japan, and Singapore, the number is growing more and more. So it's not reasonable for a business to have 10 to 15 data centers all over the world. Like that would be very operationally complex to deal with. And then it also makes it very hard to do things like global analytics. And it's also expensive. So by essentially de-scoping your system, you can continue to run a global data center. And then you only need to think about, where do I put my vaults essentially for where I'm collecting and storing this regulated information.
Well, do the vaults have to be in those respective countries, or because you've de-identified it that you can store it anywhere? And does that allow you to comply with those type of regulations?
So within your, let's say in your application database, if you're storing only the de-identified information, then that database could live wherever. But in the vault, you're actually storing the original information. So in that case, you would need vaults. If you need to comply with data locality laws, then those vaults would most likely need to live within the region where those customers exist. So you might end up with a vault in Germany, a vault in Brazil, and so forth. But it simplifies the amount of essentially infrastructure that you're deploying to those places because you're only dealing with the small amount of data, which is your customer PII. Like in the grand scheme of the amount of data that companies store, that is a very small amount of information compared to everything that we store about our application and the way that people use it.
Sure. Well, with most SaaS platforms these days, connectivity with other platforms is kind of one of the key criteria
Yep.
for their customers to select them. And when you have connectivity, you're also sharing data, right? Data's going back and forth. How does this type of process work in that context?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So obviously we store, customer data so that we can use it. And part of the use of customer data is often passing it to a third party, even for something as simple as like, hey, I need to send this customer an email. So the way that would work is instead of, typically like let's take the email example. Typically in a system where we're not using something like a data privacy vault, we would store that email probably in a database somewhere. We're going to retrieve it in our backend. We're going to make an API call to our email relay, passing the email and whatever other information that we want to send through the relay to the customer. Now, everything in the vault world works exactly the same, except that instead of retrieving the email, we're retrieving this tokenized version of the email. And instead of calling the email directly, or sort of the email relay directly, we would call the vault, and the vault would act like a proxy service, where within the sort of the isolated, protected environment of the vault, it can essentially detokenize that value back to the original email, or what other information the person's name or what other information was passed across, and then call your email relay on your behalf. So we can't completely build applications in isolation, or sorry, in like silos. We're always going to need to probably integrate with some sort of third party system, whether that's like a CRM or marketing automation platform or something like that. So some of our customer data is going to end up in those systems, but we can reduce essentially the amount of data that's going there. And we can also make it so that our actual application never actually needs to see any information. The only system that actually needs to see it in this case is the vault itself, which is essentially a more protected environment than our application.
Gotcha. And I'm just curious, and this is probably more from the compliance or legal point of view, but when your platform is sharing data with other platforms, and if they have some type of incident, breach, or whatever it is, does,